right, welcome everyone to our Friday seminar. Our speaker today is Ray Grizzle. He's a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences. His research focuses on the ecology of benthic invertebrates, and his recent projects include bottom habitat mapping of estuarine and shallow shelf environments, the impacts of open ocean aquaculture activities on benthic communities, the ecology and culture of bivalve mollusks, and oyster reef restoration. And some of this is involved work with underwater videography, which we'll see in this presentation. So let's welcome Ray to our seminar.
Thank you, Ashley. I want to start by kind of warning her that I hope this goes better than my first presentation here, the one I did about 8 years ago. And I'll tell you a short story why. I don't know, is Mayor gone? Good. Okay. There was a group of us that had been invited to speak to Carol Shea Porter. She was her first time in Congress. We were in the upstairs room where I'm not allowed into there anymore. But Larry was first on the agenda, and I was sitting there in the room like the rest, Carol Shea Porter and the others, and watching his fleeter mouse and everything going through the undersea world, and kind of thought like this is half made up, but it's really cool. So then the thought hit me, hey, you're next, and all you got are bar charts and scatter plots. So what I've done is I've added some pictures. I'm going to start with black and white, go to color, then some video. All right, so I got animated pictures as well, so I'm hoping that's a lot better. And then secondly, seriously, I think in the flyer that was out there, it said that this is for graduate students. I have a lot of oyster talks, so this is the first time through on this one. And it's 5 topics that there's no way you would want to do all 5 at one time. So I'm going to do like 5 to 10 minutes each. But I wanted to gear it toward graduate students because Ashley asked me. But there are a lot of unanswered questions, and nearly every project I've been involved in, we end up with more questions at the end than at the beginning, and we've answered a few. But we've generated a lot, and so it might give you some ideas, maybe what not to do, but basically what you might want to pursue at some point in your career. And then I'm not looking for graduate students, so all right, I'll say that at the beginning. It's one of the things I've learned. It seems like the more that I work, the less I get paid, so I'm not into that really. Okay, those are the 5 topics, and I'll need to read those to you because I'll put them up each, and they'll be numbered so you know where I am in the series. But here's my collaborators. I like to start with that. And let's see, is this the laser here? Okay. I'll begin with Linda Harnden. She was an undergraduate student in my lab when I did a postdoc here in 1987 through 89. So the first map I'm going to put up is a product of Linda Harnden. And it's a map it's a real map. It was done on Mylar with pen and ink. Ben will remember that, I'm sure, anyways. And she drafted it here over in my office in 1987. Then the majority of the maps that you're going to see will go all the way down chronologically to Kristen Ward at the end, and she's sitting in the back. She's my technician now, and she's produced most of the map work. Okay. Begin here. This is Linda's first map, 1987. And the way this is, we were looking at large-scale spatial patterns of intertidal oyster reefs in the Canaveral National Seashore. See there, it's north of Cape Kennedy, base of Cape Canaveral. And basically, the Canaveral National Seashore, it's a national park, and the national park had just been established there, and they inherited all of these shellfish leases, clam and oyster harvesting areas. And so individuals had plots out there that they could harvest. And the Park Service was interested in managing this resource. What to do with these leases didn't fit real well in the national seashore. But at any rate, they hired me to consult with them and develop a management plan. And the first part of the plan was, at any project I've done, when I'm dealing all the way up through 2 days ago, talking to some other folks in the state of Florida, you have to map your resource. And you might be surprised to find that many resource management agencies do not have maps of their resource. They don't know the quantity, where things are in the resource that they're managing. Some are easier to map than others. Oysters, fortunately, were, and that's what I did. But basically, We map the reefs and identify potential factors that determine spatial patterns. So throughout this, it's going to be looking for patterns in maps, and that's what ecologists do, basically. At least this ecologist does. We had some 1984 low-altitude aerial imagery that had been ortho-rectified, etc. And basically, some of you might recognize the base map here. It's a USGS quad graph, 1 to 24,000, that was copied onto Mylar. Then Linda overlaid that onto the photo positives and traced the oyster reefs after we went through the process of signatures and all that, and developed, so we could tell them from seagrasses mostly. But now, the way this is set up, this is a close-up, these individual oysters, and this is what an oyster reef looks like up close, a mangrove tree, and then some of them are pretty expansive, hundreds of meters long and spread out. Intertidal, we can see them, this is low tide obviously, and the way this was keyed in the paper that was published, A here is A, come on, up there, and the arrow shows you the direction it was looking. So I keyed the photos to the map that Linda made, and you see lots of oysters, big, expansive, a great blue heron, some flat top, some humped up, and some with dead margins. All right, the first thing we did before the maps were produced, well, let me back up. In looking at the map, we had also gone out, and so we knew where they were, approximately what was where, basically. And then when we got it on the map, we began to look for patterns. And if those of you who've been looking at this map for a while might see one pattern, at any rate. You see any pattern in the reefs, which are all the little black dots? Somebody might see a pattern, surely. Decreasing, increasing, associated with different things. Those are all mangrove islands, all the little hatch marks. Jeez, Linda saw that pattern. I don't know. Well, this is north.
No, they're more in the north.
Yes, correct. They're more in the north, and so basically what came out of it was decreasing number of reefs and bottom area coverage from north to south, and the most reefs were on the edges of the tidal chain. So we picked that out. We couldn't pick that out driving around on the boat, but we picked it out after she put it on the map. And then we developed this, did this plot. Tidal range, I had measured tidal range in 10 spots around the 10, you didn't see all 10, but from north to south, and that's what the relationship was. Now, if you look at that, I remember when I plotted, I said, this is pretty darn good. But then there are no oysters in the subtitles, so maybe this is a trivial cause in it. Maybe it's not, it's just a correlation, but if they don't occur in the subtidal, well, clearly if the tidal range is down around 0, there's not going to be a lot of oysters. And so it's complicated. That said, the unanswered questions, we'll start with this middle one. Are tidal range and tidal currents sufficient for predicting some reef characteristics? Well, this little multiple regression model here is pretty darn good for predicting bottom area coverage. It's not just the range though, but it's the area. So you can see a different amount of slopes, you could have different area available. But basically, you get a maximum percentage of coverage by intertidal reefs. There's a little bit of literature on that, but this would be a really good topic for further research. In the last 30 years, though, there are 2 new diseases have come in and really complicate them. Now they kill off oysters after 3 years, generally in Florida. So you don't see big old oysters anymore. They used to get 10 to 20 years old, now it's 3 to 5. Same here in New Hampshire as well. So we got that, it's a complicated factor. And then what role does predation and other factors play in restricting oysters? The oysters are zoned biogeographically, intertidal, subtidal, all north of Virginia. It's probably ice, probably some ice predator interaction. But now in the last 5 years, we now have the major predator here, the blue crabs, come around the Cape, and it's established now. So there's a lot of cool stuff that could be done just with oysters. The second thing we did after that is the seashore wanted to look historically. So we want to see how stable some of these reefs had been. We saw some dead areas and that sort of thing. But we came up with some money to basically characterize long-term changes and identify potential causes. So they wanted to look and see where were the old reefs, how they might manage them in the sense of conserving them based on historical changes. Well, we came upon some 1943 black and white 9x9 color, prints that were just absolutely gorgeous, way sub-meter resolution. In fact, flew the whole coast during World War II. So I sent my tech, I gave my tech a credit card and sent him to Florida. The credit card was a big mistake, but he found imagery from at about 10-year, no, it was about 5 to 8 year intervals all the way up through for this area to 2000. So it's basically a gold mine, all prints, mostly prints, some photo negatives, and he digitized them, and then basically allowed us to produce the maps I'm going to show you next. This map is really the one from before, with 9 areas that we could do surface area calculations and manage them basically statistically and otherwise. So we decided to look at them and look at them over time, and we had good imagery from these areas. So basically, field inspection to look for potential causes and comparison of selected 1 kilometer or so square areas with a 57 or so year data set. Pretty remarkable at the time. Well, we started finding these dead margins, live reef behind them, dead margins, A through C. And then a lot of areas 100% covered by live oysters, different shapes. See the texture on top here, there. E and F live, and then nearly all of them adjacent to tidal channels and in the intertidal zone. So that allowed us to focus on, when we look historically, we're going to look at the shape of the reef, but we're going to also look at these dead margins and see what's going on with them. These images were really better than is shown here, but 43, 51, 63, most reefs showed very little change. So look at that cluster of 5 all the way along. Pretty similar. Some reefs had an increase in dead margins, the black areas. So at this cluster, the first black area showed up in 1988. But some reefs became all dead margins. They weren't a dead margin, they were just a pile of dead shell, basically. And down here, it had started in 1943. Continual increase up to where virtually all dead, that cluster, by 2000. So then, why? And I know somebody can figure this out. Somebody, do you happen to know where that line there might be? It's the intercoastal waterway. Ben, you've been down the intercoastal waterway.
Actually, I have not. No.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
I know where it is.
Yeah, it's a dredge channel that goes from Maine to Florida, basically. It allows smaller vessels to come travel in behind the barrier island, basically. So it's maintained, I think, at 15 feet or something. But it was already there in 1943, and this white dot is surrounded by mangroves is a spoil island. So they made all of these spoil islands. It's related to that, the dead margins. But it progressed. The channel stayed the same. But what would have increased from 1943 to 2000 in Florida if any of you have been down there and been on the waterway? Not pollution at all. The boats. Boats traffic there is mind-boggling. I grew up in Florida. You can see 20 yachts lined up in wakes coming that high that have tremendous amount of wave energy. So basically, that's what we came up with. And the unanswered question now, from a management perspective, is what level of wave energy, especially those associated with boat wakes, can oyster reefs tolerate? And they're basically just pushing the reefs back. And it's not just Florida; it's the whole intercoastal waterway where reefs occur. Again, the 2 diseases, they're doing things, they're affecting the recruitment to the reefs, the longevity of them, etc. And then what methods are appropriate for reef restoration? This is what's going on. A lot of oyster reef restoration is ongoing. About 20 countries now are involved in this. And Florida has a lot of reef restoration that they want to do. But you need the right methods, and you don't want to spend your money in areas that the wave energies are too high. And at the time when we found this would have been back around 90. I remember talking to the Park Service, and of course my suggestion was, well, we put no wake zones around these areas, being a simple-minded thinker, what else, why would we not want to do this? And he informed me that, well, we have manatees here that are an endangered species, and the best we can do is 20 knots, decrease them to 20 knots. So there was no possibility that they were going to be able to do it for oysters if they couldn't do it for the manatee. But it's still a big management issue. and there's a fair amount of research that needs to be done in that area. Okay, number 3, we're staying with oysters. 2 parts to this I broke down: assessing methods, and then map production that allowed us to look at using maps to determine where we should site new oyster reefs. And finally, we're going to get, let me back up. We're going to get to something that has to do with sound waves. Single beam, multiple beam side scan. Basically, what I'm going to present for the next few slides is work that Sima Dijkstra and Brian Smith was here for a while did. And we basically were looking for a suite of methods, assessing a suite of methods from single beam, from the sonars, total on-orbit video, and quadrat sampling by divers, which is kind of the standard method that's been going for a long time. You send a diver over with a quadrat, they excavate it, they bring it up, you count it. It's a real tedious, dangerous, on process, and expensive. So we were looking at to come up with some suite of methods that could allow the state agencies to develop a standard protocol for doing everything from mapping the whole reef down to the characteristics of the reef. But before we do that, let's see, I'm going to, how can I do this? Show you a video. And the first one I'm going to show, these are not National Geographic videos, all right? But this is the finest reef going probably on the East Coast. And this is looking down on, it's in a top secret place. It's the mouth of the Squamscott River. It's in a closed area, and if you look there, all those little oval-looking things are oysters. They're sticking straight up. You can't see the vertical structure, but it's about a foot in some areas. It's a rough surface, and all the way down into the channel, coming back up the edge. 100% cover, about 200 oysters per square meter. And that's where anchor or something was. Okay, that's the way reefs used to look like. Basically, I know a lot of you here, a lot of folks are not familiar with oyster reefs, but basically familiar with coral reefs. I'm going to show you some of them at the end. But it's basically these huge aggregations of oysters that have cemented themselves together, and it could be 1 million in an acre or more. And they tend to grow vertically. So all these nooks and crannies and crevices, and they're valuable for the habitat that they provide for other creatures, and then they filter a lot of water. And this particular reef was in an area that's close to harvest, has enough fresh water to knock down the diseases, and really looks good. And it's been used, they've come up from Maryland to video it as a reef used to look, all right? Let's see, is this the right one? Oh, that's the wrong one. Now, this is a reef that's in pretty good shape. North of Woodman Point, and the difference is there are a lot of live oysters, but there are a lot of dead scattered shell. Algae growing on it, seaweeds, a lot of creatures in there. This is about the typical New Hampshire reef now. A lot of structure there, a lot of epiphytes, a lot of things going for this reef, but pretty darn flat surface. This is just north of Nanny Island. You see, this was done 11/19 of 12. This is about the best we can do now, pretty much anywhere, really. The Southeast still has intertidal reefs that look good. This is the video system we typically use. It'll overlay the coordinates. This is a long video, Kristen. And then this is, sadly, this is the way that a lot of the reefs look. And this is what happens when you go in on tongs or dredges or whatever they're using, and it's pretty much a shell pile. A lot of dead shell, but a scattered live oysters every now and then. So another thing to notice here in this video, this is basically, I'm going to get back to this, I'm going to get to this later, but this is the kind of imagery that Kristen looks at for hour after hour when we're mapping reefs. So you're basically going along, classifying it at certain intervals and putting it in a spreadsheet with the coordinates, and you basically do classified ship tracks. Okay, now the sonar. The top image is from some of Sima's work, and I forgot what single beam unit he used, but some kind of a sounder. And basically the thing to get here is the pink, and I was hoping he's here so he could maybe stand up and give you the details, but basically the return that he classified, the signal that he classified, allowed him to, these were different color, you're all familiar with that I think. But this down here, what he did is we overlaid the classified ship tracks that Kristen did, and there were the red is a high density shell, and she had I think 3 classes. But basically you compare the pink with the red, and pretty much oyster shell bottom clearly identifies. No trouble for the single beam, no trouble for the video. The differences were clearly discernible. But so basically after this study that was, I forgot when the final report came, but essentially what I came up with is video is usually a ground truthing tool. Well, we can tow it, we can log GPS. It doesn't need a lot of expertise to identify the imagery. There's some level, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But so we started using it as a primary mapping tool. And basically what's happened in the state of New Hampshire is every 5 years my laboratory does the mapping. And it could be done with single beam, but basically I think single beam lost out because of the cost, Tom, but also maybe because of the interest, I'm not sure. But my point in this is that towed video became a primary mapping tool. And for us, it came because of this study. Now, to go on further, Sima also laid some Kongsberg multi-beam over this, and that's the shaded area here. I'm sure you recognize that. I have the arrow to it. So, and this was just bathymetry, and basically we saw all this out here, and this was before this map was done, but you didn't really know. It was just a shelf area, shallower in the red and deeper as you go down into the blue and the green. But then we came along in 2012 and went out there and checked that area out, and it was mostly live oysters. So basically, bathymetry is all you need in some areas to pick out the oyster. You can see the overlay here of this was pretty much live oysters, same way out here. The black here is that the video was, you couldn't see it, or no, it's non-reef, and then the yellow is mostly dead shell, and the green here is eelgrass, by the way. So basically we discovered this new area, and it was done by video. Now, but there are certainly some let me back up.
Right.
Yeah, sure, Jen.
Sorry. So with that blue, so the top photo.
Yeah.
The blue is that dead shell or just mud?
It's mud.
Or is that-
It's mostly a soft sediment, right?
Okay.
Mud. Okay. I thought I had that on this slide, but basically, I guess I'll come to the very serious limitations of video, at least that my laboratory has come up with at the end of this one then. Okay, so the second part of this, the oyster mapping, was in the Great Bay Piscataqua estuarine system, we need to look for restoration sites. Whether or not you know about it, since about 1999 and around 2000, 14, 15 years ago or so, the state decided that they needed to begin to restore oyster reefs. There was a big crash in the mid-90s when these diseases moved in and caused a die-off of one entire reef. The management agency chose not to stop harvest, which the way a lot of them did actually, up and down the East Coast. So you have a new disease in the face of continued harvest, and we basically, if you look at the bar charts of oyster density and numbers, it's just down to about the early 2000s or so. So there's these oyster restoration programs. Well, the question then is, how much do we need to bring back, and where should we site these oyster restoration projects? Because there's very definite limited funds. So what we did then, just what I just explained before, video, position, log continuously, and this is really one of the big problems with video. And you classify it into multiple categories, and then we just do visual interpolation, and then use ARC to construct polygons. And then basically I'll start here. The yellow are the mapped natural reefs that are there that have some amount of live oysters in the estuary. So you see the distribution. That distribution itself is kind of interesting, but we haven't really tried to do the Florida thing down here. They're basically in the tributaries with one glaring exception, the largest reef that's there right in the middle of Great Bend. As it turns out, with water filling this section of the bay, the currents across there are just wonderful, just ideal for oyster feeding, settlement, etc. probably. So this is a 35 or so acre reef here as well. But most of them are in the streams. And we've done 15 or so sites. But now we'll go to this map. This was done last year. And these are classified ship tracks with the red height, you see it there, greater than 20%, some live shell and less. And then the black being, I think, no shell, I don't remember exactly. Eelgrass, we didn't map that, but that is probably the major constraining factor in where we site our reefs. With state legislation, eelgrass is an essential fish habitat, it's managed, it's protected, and so we're not really allowed to do any oyster restoration in areas that eelgrass is, even though oysters and eelgrass occur together in some areas in kind of a patchwork mosaic. But at any rate, it's a constraining factor on the restoration, and it would require a certain method, a different method than typically what we're using. But basically, we do polygons around these areas that are close to a live oyster, to brood stock that can supply them with the larvae and the baby oysters that they need, and in certain type of sediment and a depth that's subtidal. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple, but just in these two mapped areas from 2012, we identified 6 potential restoration sites. So over the years, what we've learned is we need, other than the factors that I mentioned, subtidal, out of eelgrass, we need a substrate that's firm enough so that the shell doesn't get covered. And we don't really understand, I wish Larry Ward was here, even though he said it wouldn't be. He's a new grandfather, if that hasn't been announced. Yesterday, I think, so it'll be his 3rd grandchild. He thought that was more important than my presentation, I guess. But the amount of sediment in the estuary, the more that I've been out there and looked at, it's an incredible amount of silt that moves around. And at one time, an area can be depositional, then it can be scoured and come back, and we've lost entire beds, reefs that we put out in one storm, completely covered with silt, and then maybe slowly get uncovered or not. And we've done one set of deep cores into Bellamy, and there are shell horizons as you go down the mud down to 3 feet or so. So it looks like in a lot of these areas of the estuary, it can alternate between a hard shell bottom, live oysters, and then soft mud. And then if you go into this reef here, this is Nanny, the big reef. When we sample that with a new sampler we have that really penetrates, and I was expecting it to be all shell all the way down, but as soon as we broke through the crust, it was a soft mud. So sometimes it's sand, sometimes it's not. If we had a 100-year understanding, like we did in the Florida, we'd certainly know more about restoration here. But basically, that's the process, and those are the criteria that we're looking at. The unanswered questions. Well, the sonar and oyster reef mapping, you'll have to see Sima. Unfortunately, he's not here. But there's a lot to be done there. And what I would like to see is some combination of the sonar and the towed video, because the big limitation really for towed video is right here. And we've tried to do in areas where if I can see 1.5 feet, 18 inches, we can map it. But sometimes you can't see that in these estuaries. And then the tow speeds, just no matter what we've got, over 2 knots is about it. So instead of running 10 knots or whatever your ship can run on your sonar, then we definitely cover a lot less area. And we have paired the two and done exactly what I'm talking about, mapping seaweeds in Florida, but we didn't talk about that today. And then here, the third one. We still need to understand more about what live reef features are most relevant to this restoration success. Because believe it or not, we've been doing restoration here since 1999, and we have yet to get funding to do an assessment past 2 years or so. And those of you that are in the proposal writing and grant getting, if you're not doing oysters, it may not matter to you. Typically 1 year, 2 year, 3 year kind of project. At the end of that second year, typically mine were 2 years, you write your final report and it goes in a file cabinet. And quite frankly, I've written a lot of final reports that are still in file cabinets. So if you don't publish, that's kind of like just going in a black hole. But the problem with that, with oyster reef restoration, and maybe there's some budding oyster reef restoration scientists here, you need a 5 to 10 year assessment of a lot of these projects to see what's going to work. And I've practically at meetings begged the funding agencies, figure out how to set aside some money. Set aside some percentage of your budget to keep these monitoring and assessment projects going. We just now have started a 10-year assessment here, and it's 100% funded by me. We still couldn't get any agencies on board on this. So I'm going to try not to whine anymore. Anyways, that's the end of my whining for that. Okay, topic 4, getting near the end. This topic was a bit unusual than any that I had ever done. We definitely away from oysters, which was kind of my bailiwick, but it's seafloor ecology. So I've been in and out of seafloor ecology for a long time, and this money became available to assess the western Gulf of Maine fishing closure area, is what it was, and I'll show you the map of that in a minute. And it became available through a group that we had here, the Northeast Consortium, which paired scientists with fishermen. And so the scientists would typically go out and pair up with the fishermen, write the proposal, get the money, and it was a great thing. I did like 3 projects with them, and I thought they were fabulous. But in this particular case, this was the first big one. What effect had the closure had on bottom habitats? And then once we found that out to some level, we went ahead and said, let's look at the ground fish themselves. So we ended up with gillnet sampling as well. So this is kind of like 5 years of work. The first area was right here. We picked this area. This is the big lopped off, I forgot how many 100 square kilometers it was. It was closed to commercial fishing inside here. And the way that the regs were written was it's closed to gear that's capable of catching groundfish. The party boats could still go out there, but no gill nets, trawls, or dredges were allowed in there. So we chose this area, and Larry Mayer was one of the PIs on this one. So it's kind of half in and half out. All right, and that's a hint at the design for the ecologists came up with. But basically, this was our study area. Then the second phase is the red, and we broadened that when we started looking at the fish because they have a broader area and for other reasons. But we still incorporated this area and still had half in and half out. Okay, so it's an inside versus outside, those of you that are into study designs, but it's not a backy design, a before-after control impact. And the reason being is we couldn't turn back the clock and do the before, and there was no data of the kind that we were going to collect before. So it was just a inside versus outside, which has some problems conceptually in interpreting your data, but still it was good, I think. Multiple studies over several years. Okay, what effect has the closure had? Basically, first thing was a multi-beam bathymetric map to guide the seafloor sampling. So we had a new map of the bathymetry there. The backscatter was involved, but we just used bathymetry, I think, when it finally settled out. And then there was this towed underwater video system, and this is Larry and myself when we were younger men. And it was designed and built here, Lloyd Huff. I don't know if some of you may remember Lloyd, but basically this was one of Lloyd's toys, basically. And he built that, and then we just used off-the-shelf box core. This is Craig Mavrikis, a fisherman. So everything was deployed. Besides, although the camera was deployed, this was on a Challenger, but it eventually was deployed off a shipping vessel. So we were out on these shipping boats. We were videoing the seafloor after Larry produced the bathymetric, and Mashkor had produced the bathymetric map, and then sampling it with the Wagco box core. So this is the map that came out of it. It doesn't really do it justice, this slide, but this is basically, again, the design. We split note fishing, closure, commercial fishing. Beautiful texture to this, and it ranged from right in here 600 feet deep, high organic content mud. When we sampled, that came in like 14-15% loss on ignition. You couldn't have more loss on ignition at a wastewater outfall than in this deep hole here. And then boulder fields right along here. So that's the kind of sampling we had to accomplish. And then I used to tell people that if you like this map, you can get your own for $97,000. So that's how much it costs. Okay, now this is Larry's map, Moshkor's map, and I'm not going to go over all this, but this is the kind of sampling that we did. This has got to be the most sampled square of seafloor on the planet. It's what at the end of this when it came. It was like about 4 years of sampling or so. But we did what we could, what kind of sampling was appropriate, and then basically, if you could, those of you that are wondering what kind of map's going to come out of this besides the sonar, we're going to produce some ecological maps. And in the most straightforward way was we took our data. Well, this is what the Hubbard camera would produce. So we could, with the 3 laser beams, we could measure and we could count and we could ID creatures. So we get quantitative data, but we couldn't weigh them because they didn't bring it back. The grab would allow us to bring them back. But in the mud here, no big deal. But when you start getting into gravel, or this is the edge of a boulder, but you can count and identify. So we ended up with counts from the video, and then we also had counts, weights, and ID from the samples as well. Well, this is what we produced, dozens and dozens and dozens of these. And many, many patterns look like this. There's more stuff inside than there was outside, basically. We looked at distance to the edge, there's spillover effects from closed areas, and all kinds of things. And we had a PhD statistician on this, and he worked a lot of days on the data set. And we did publish one paper on this, but basically, some taxa, sponges and tunicates, epifauna that hang onto the side of boulders or in other hard substrates were dramatically affected, at least typically many less inside, the mean several-fold more inside, than outside. And then some taxa, particularly the infauna, mostly big infaunal tunicates and worms and other things, and bivalves, no pattern at all. And if you look at it statistically overall, it's this kind of thing. A lot of stuff inside and not so much outside. So I didn't show you the fishing data, but we also had from the recorders on the ships, we could parse out the fishing data by gear type. And so as it turned out, it was mostly gill nets running up there, which that's the only kind of gear that can work the rough ledges. So then we had this kind of interest say, well, all the literature's on trawls, hardly anything on gill nets. So now we had this bit of information showing the effect of gill nets. We said, well, let's use gill nets and go out and sample the fish that are there and see what we come up with. So that was the second phase. So then we paired up with another fisherman, Mike Leary here, and the Seabat, his had the only catamaran in the fleet, and he could run 25 knots with that thing, so he could outrun all the other fishermen 8-10 knots and go out further. But superb fishermen. There's a Troy and Tommy. That's Holly back there, and that's a gill net. So basically, we did 44 paired runs sampling inside and outside comparable habitats with multi-mesh gill nets. So we're looking for juveniles up to big cod or whatever. Identify, count, weigh all the fish and invertebrates, and that's what Holly and Kristen and I did day after day, cruising offshore and having a good old time. And this is one of the cod that we caught, and I wasn't supposed to be in the picture, but little Holly just couldn't hold the cod up. It was 50-something pounds. You could stick your head in the mouth of that monster. But that was actually, we caught 20-something of these in one day, one haul basically. And it kind of interesting as a side, any of you that know gill netting, that day we only had a 4-inch mesh. Well, the way a gill net works is you have the mesh, and it's a fine monofilament line, and the fish goes in, sticks its head in, and then it can't come back out. So it's kind of a sad story. But these particular fish were caught in a 4-inch mesh, and guess how they were all caught? With their teeth. So the way a gill net boat works is you got a big drum that turns around, and the the fisherman puts the net in the drum, and it kind of basically rolls it in, and then it comes along a table. So it's coming up the side 6 or 8 feet from the water, get up, and all these big cod just started rolling out of this net. I can still remember Mike Leary, the captain, screaming, "Ah!" He's yelling because they're rolling out back in the water. And he's seeing every one of these rolling. It's $150, $200 rolling out of the net into the water. But we captured a lot. I mean, we did release. Nearly all of these just swam away, which I was surprised at, coming up from 150 feet of water, but they did fine. So basically, after the 44, we were like this much, 10, 6, 40% or so abundance and wet weight. And all the big folks, the big females, greater than 10 kilograms and greater than 2 grams for the pollock, were in the closed area. So we really had a nice story here. Never did haven't yet published the gillnet part, but it certainly correlated very well with seafloor recovery, favored the fish. But there's still a lot of questions. And then the big thing that came out of it too was dogfish related to groundfish, a very negative correlation. If you know the fishing, the dogfish, a shark that's come in, the fishermen hate them. They kill as many as they can that come in nets, but they'll just fill up a net. And we caught a lot of dogfish. We caught a few cod, and they're competitors, so nothing unusual about that. But what needs to be done is kind of surprising to me. So let me go through this, and I'll get to the question. No doubt there was some recovery of the benthos. But what does changes in sponges and sea squirts and things that we know that we think the fish don't eat or whatever, there are environmental indicators and indicators of the quality. Well, what does that have to do with rebuilding fish stocks? But then the effects on groundfish, do the big cod more in the area really reflect general trends for rock habitat? Is it really just a close? Is it related to what we found up here? And then I could go on and on and on and on. We could fill up this room with PhD dissertations on work that could be done out in that closed area. But I'll finish this by saying, I think it's the last one, yeah. When all this came about, I asked one of the National Marine Fisheries Service biologists, I think it was Burowski, but I said, let's say that you found that cod, that dogfish, the shark, was controlling the rebound of the cod population. Could you have a target fishery or do something about that? He said, by federal law, we're prohibited because the dogfish is a fish, it has a fishery rebuilding plan, and nothing can be done to alter that. So those of you that are into ecosystem-based management and think that's just rolling along fine, it's held up by existing legislation that's focused on the species, and that's the way fisheries management still is today. There is a movement in that trend, but the fisheries managers have to manage by species, and there's going to have to be an overhaul in a lot of ways about that. But to me, this field, and I'm not a fishery biologist, but I hung around with them for a few years, this is a field that really could see a pairing of mapping and ecologists, etc. Okay, the last one, coming up on the end here. 3 years ago, we were hired to do a shellfish, didn't really do mapping. We didn't produce maps, but we did a countrywide survey of the United Arab Emirates because they began having red tide blooms, and they wanted to know the public health significance. And if those of you that are familiar with the red tide, it's a phytoplankton that blooms and it produces toxins. And some mollusks, particularly clams and oysters, filter them, accumulate the toxins, so there's public health significance. So they want to know what species they had in the Arabian Gulf and the Sea of Oman. I'll get to that in a moment. And then what might be the public health significance? What did they need to control? And what did they need to manage? So they hired us to do mollusks. Well, we did that, and Kristen and I essentially did all that. And then I was in the office over there in the ministry one day, and Rashid, our contact, the fellow that we work for there, he said, do you know how to map corals and mangroves? And I'm like, I can map anything. So we basically stumbled into that essentially because it's the same kind of process of aerial imagery, etc. So then I called on colleagues that are mangrove people and are coral people, and we basically got contracts to map the coral and mangroves. And the important part, I think, is interpret the maps, because the mapping could be done by a number of people, but interpret in the context of environmental management implications, that the team as a whole had a lot of experience in environmental management. Basically, all mapped with satellite imagery, visual interpretation, basically the way that it works, identification of hypothetical habitats, or the polygons are hypothetical. Then the video in this case was really the ground truthing component, because there's a lot of area to cover, and diver ground truthing, and then final map production. So basically, those of you who are familiar with the United Arab Emirates, here it is. And it seems that most people know about Dubai and the tallest building, and all the just incredible dredging and filling that's going on in that country. But here's the, well, it shows up officially as the Persian Gulf, but the UAE folks prefer the Arabian Gulf, and that's what we call it when we're there, basically. Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia. And then the Red Sea is a comparable system, basically, coastal system to this, but we found a lot of differences. The Red Sea is known for its corals, high diversity, etc. Arabian Gulf, known for its paucity of corals, extreme environmental conditions, salinities of 50, temperatures of one up in the 30, I forgot how close, but it seemed like boiling to me practically, but air temperatures of 110, 120 in that range. A hot system, high salinities, but a lot of coral, as I'll show you. And then these are just some of the sites that we see. And basically this is a 100-kilometer line. So basically for the mangroves, Greg would produce the maps, and we'd fly into Dubai, rent a nice Camry, and drive. And basically go to ground truth areas that he, and so we basically end up driving the whole country. And it's mostly desert, coastal system, and here are the mountains along, and this is Oman. And so there's, on this western side, eastern side, excuse me, mountains like that look to me just like the Mars rover would send back images, because nothing on them, and very red looking in most areas. And there's the tallest building in the world. And there's Ali pointing out his technician out there digging clams and things. Okay, I knew I'd be out of time at this point, but basically just do big picture findings. Coastal development is just, it's incredible over there, how much dredging and filling is going on, and I'll show you one example. But it's diminishing the coastal habitats, mangroves, corals, seagrasses, you name it. The MOEW, the Ministry of Environment and Water that we're working for, I mean, I just can't imagine being a management agency in that kind of environment that's just driven by huge money. And I say big money, it's huge money. And they're trying to, their job is to manage it, and they're trying, and so that's why one of the reasons why they've hired us. So we're doing the maps and we're making suggestions, but I guess I don't want to say I'm pessimistic, but I'm not overly optimistic as to how things are going to go, but things are going anyways. But an interesting find, really interesting, and John Burt, the coral guy, found this out a few years ago, but we were able to map it basically. As the dredging and filling is occurring, they're making like the Palm Jumeirah, these palms out in the Arabian Gulf, and they're surrounding all of them with breakwaters. It's from the mountains. They're just truckload after truckload coming over to make the breakwaters, and they fill behind it, destroy the coral reefs in some areas where they fill, but the breakwaters are being colonized by coral. So they're probably going to have the largest breakwater coral reefs in the world before long, in addition to the tallest building. They've also established quite a few protected areas, and that's the thing that I think I'm the most proud of at this point. Well, I'll show you the development. If you go into Google Earth and do the historical maps thing, just go over there and do the Arabian Gulf. 2009, this beautiful mangrove seagrass bar-built lagoon system. 2012, a nice new marina with condominiums and stuff on it. It's just place after place after place along there like that. Okay, the mangroves real quick. This is the kind of thing you see, real arid environment. It can be these little sparse, little scrubby things. So there's Kristen standing there with 5-7 meter kind of mangrove. And she's right there adjacent. It's all filled and busted up asphalt. So it's just filling and dredging. And then there's the kind of scene you think you're out in the middle of nowhere, but geez, there's something behind those mangroves. It's pretty incredible. And this building, and these two buildings here, they're the same, but I think they're under construction. I don't know. It's hard to say. Half the buildings have cranes on top of them. At one point, they had half the large construction cranes on the planet was in the UAE. That's what I was told. I didn't count them, but I wouldn't doubt that. And then this is Greg on this huge former dune system looking down on some mangroves that had been dredged and filled some, but just some incredible scenery. Flamingos are everywhere over there, a big migratory area. But mangroves of all different sizes, from the scrubby little ones barely hanging on to the big, really nice looking forest. The coral, real quickly, I'm coming to the end. Now this is basically, for those interested, this is the signature. This is what coral looks like, moderate to high density, low, and then seagrasses. And we can tell pretty easily a similar pattern, a little different color in the true color imagery. And then the circular aspect on the coral had to do with the dark. The circular aspect, feeding pits from fishes and turtles for the seagrasses, were the light. So as it turned out, I was 85% on my thematic accuracy for identifying hard bottom versus seagrasses. Not so good on live coral, only about half. But the reason probably being because most of it was dead. In most cases, these reefs have died because of they've had some temperature extremes, and then the red tide knocked a lot of them back as well. But the overall result is we came up with greater than 62 new coral habitats, basically reef areas. And most all of these along here had never been mapped. We have a few out in here in Abu Dhabi, and then some dive sites over on the East Coast. And the thing that I think that I'm the most excited about is there's this lagoon system in Al Quwain, actually the poorest emirate of the seven. But it's just a fabulous lagoon system, and all the green here is mangroves. But this is a preliminary thing that Kristen did. The green seagrasses, high density coral, the pink is low density coral, and then sand. And basically, it's this, really the diversity is just all over the place. When we were up in here with the video camera looking at these areas, that sea turtles around, beautiful area. So we've suggested that they take the initial steps toward making that an MPA, Marine Protected Area. And we have a proposal in, and they're considering it, but it's about the last system like that left in the country, basically. And probably because it's in an Al Quwain area that's 50, 75 kilometers from the Dubai area. It hasn't really been hammered as much by the development. And then I'll end with a couple of the coral reefs. Yeah, this is, this is the right. Yeah, this is about the best they do with reefs. Those of you who know coral reefs, you don't see the big table-like corals, but you see the little finger-like corals, porites, the favias, the brain corals. You see them scattered along in it. But pretty high cover and a lot of fish. The diversity here is about I think it's a fourth of the Red Sea, probably down toward a tenth or so of the northern Indian Ocean, but because of the extreme conditions. And I want to show you the one. This is what a lot of them look now, sadly, because of these temperature extremes and the red tide. And what happens right off the bat, you see the rubble-looking material is the skeletons from the hard coral, but it gets all colonized by seaweed. And this is why, really, I couldn't really tell the difference, probably, because dead coral, live coral look the same in the satellite image. But the satellite imagery that we were using was pretty incredible as well. Sub-meter resolution from GOI-1 stuff, and not too expensive either. And that's what I'll end with, is you might recognize some people there, I don't know. Those are the folks that did the work. Okay, there you go. If you have any questions, I'll take them. Yep.
Is there any legislation pending to protect seagrass or mangroves? Or
over there, yeah. Not that I know of. We haven't really looked at the legislation. I've talked to the managers, of course, because we work for them. And I'm trying to probe the process a little bit and see how it might go. But they're developing policy. But there is some protection, but it's kind of like, it depends on what the sheikh says, basically, when a project. It's what they tell us. You can come, you can say protection, but then each emirate has its own sheikh, the leader. And so then that's where that decision is going to be made. So like if the developer goes in, and I'm an outsider, but the way I understand the process, the developer will go in and make a presentation, and the ministry might be involved in it, and they will say what they want to say to the sheikh who's going to make the decision, and then the money flows and the decision's made. But you just see signs of Queen. One of them was, what was it, Kristen? It was like estuarine something, but it was a marina that was stopped, and it was in that lagoon system, basically. But they're big billboards that this is going to be the future and all that. It's just incredible. So there is policy, but how enforceable it is, I don't see a lot of it being enforced. Derek.
So you were saying something about the fisheries management here in dogfish. I just wanted to clarify that a bit.
Yeah.
So the legislation actually legislates quotas, and as opposed to giving the managers a license to change the quotas?
Well, yeah. Each species that's managed, every species that's managed as a fishery has a plan for it. And so the dogfish, as it turns out, is a fishery and has a rebuilding plan. Well, cod do too, but there's no way to, if you have a rebuild.
Dogfish are now too plentiful, right? At
Oh,
least
yeah.
that's the opinion.
Well, that's, there's a lot of debate on that, but the fishermen are like, when you go out there and they bring in one net 100 meters long, it has 500 pounds of dogfish and nothing else in it. And then and that's it's still like, why isn't this changed? Well, what would they go to? The history of fisheries management, that I understand it, is a species by species management plan, and then that's just the way that it is. They're still using the trawls that we've been using for well over 50 years as well. And some of the sonar people have been working for midwater multi-beam for years to try to use that as the measuring tool. But I just think that the fisheries area is one that's particularly with map-related kinds of things, and sonar. Tom.
I didn't, you may have mentioned this, but I didn't quite catch it. Why is wave energy bad for oyster
Okay.
reefs?
Well, it was the last question I had. What are the limits of it? And basically, at some point, it's not bad. I mean, it's going to stir up bottom sediments that can provide food transport to it and all that. But then when it reaches a certain point, it starts tearing up the reef. Before that, it'll get to where the larvae probably don't settle, or once they settle, they're pretty delicate. The life history of the oyster says it has a larval form. It's 2 weeks in, it's external fertilization, swims around, so to speak, with currents for 2 weeks. It's a 400 micrometer size, really pretty delicate live creature, and it settles, and in a matter of hours, it begins to cement itself down. My guess is the moving sediment, etc., early on with waves that are, say, this high are sufficient to keep the spat settlement down. But when they get to be this high, like some of these yachts have, I mean, they just tear the reef up and just break the shells apart and push them up on the beach. So at some point along that, no waves or small waves, it might even be positive relationship, and then it reaches to a point and it's negative after that.
And these waves are breaking against the shore.
Oh, yes, where the oysters are. If they come along, the boat comes along at high tide, you'd measure it then, okay, you'd have wave orbit velocity and all that, maybe not too much. But boy, if it comes on at low tide, it's incredible to watch that thing break on that reef. So it's just hammering it with the full force of the wave. And that's what they need to figure out, I think. Then they could, but if they can't control the boats for the sea cow, the manatee, then, like I said, it's, yes.
Is there a way to look at that seasonally?
Oh, yeah.
North of Florida.
Yeah, oh, wait a minute, look at boat wake seasonally?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
probably places like North Carolina and North, there's not as much boat wake in the
that-
winter? Or are they spawning in the winter?
Well, I've been on the intertidal reefs from North Carolina all the way down, and you see the same pattern of these dead margins. They line the intercoastal and a lot of the major boat channels. So, but a comprehensive mapping hasn't been done. So, it's just all somebody out there in a boat like myself looking and see it. And we're talking right now, talking with the Nature Conservancy about coming up with a method that on a county by county basis in Florida, they need to map their entire resource, and they've yet to really do that. Some counties have maps, some don't. So I guess the short answer is that it's just not known, but that would be, there are all kind of experiments then and studies you could do. Again.
I've got a question again about this.
All right.
This has to do with the subtidal area.
Yeah.
There aren't oysters, or the oysters don't like subtidal. They like to be in the intertidal area. They like to be exposed.
Okay. It's complicated. South of Virginia, they occur intertidally and subtidally. from Brevard, actually from Cape Canaveral south. I mean, there are areas where they're only intertidal. There are areas where they're both subtidal, and it used to be north of Cape Cod in particular only subtidal, but they're starting to occur intertidally here and now as well. And the only place that we find them now, here in the Damascus, I had a student did a paper on that, is if you have to go out into the boulders and lift up the rockweed and look under it. And there, it's basically probably providing them with a temperature buffer and an ice scour buffer. So they're intertidal in some areas, subtidal and intertidal in other areas, and then subtidal in others. And that's why I say there's room for all kinds of biogeographic studies there. Yes.
I thought the ones in the Carolina, the intertidal oysters were dying and the subtidal ones were surviving.
Well, they may be. In Florida, in fact, that one estuary, the one in Canaveral there are subtidals there, but typically the way we thought they got there is the oyster, and it had the lease, would knock them off the intertidal down to the subtidal to fatten up. So they were kind of making these, and they were big enough so the blue crabs couldn't eat them. So there is this human oyster interaction that's probably causing some changes in this. Yeah.
Okay. Do you know where, so I actually have a couple questions. So the oysters that you find here in the subtidal where there's a mixture of oyster and macroalgae, does the macroalgae actually, will it lift the oysters up during strong storms, or does it?
Yeah. I think it could. I mean, like codium or something,
Right.
the oyster thief or whatever it is. Yeah, I believe that could occur, but quite frankly, I've never seen an oyster that it looks like it's being transported around. The one that would do it here would probably be Gracilaria. All of them might, but we saw there's quite a diversity of seaweeds on these reefs, but I haven't seen them really being transported around. And it would have to be a single. If it's attached, if it's part of the reef, it's not going to transport it around.
And then is there a negative effect of macroalgae on oysters?
Well, yeah, potentially, like if a big mat of drift algae came in, was lodged on the reef and began to decompose, yeah. But I think that the thing with macroalgae, this is kind of another one of my pet peeves, is that the seagrass people in particular always like to talk about nuisance algae. And it's almost like that's all there is. Well, wait a minute, there's dozens of species. The Ascophyllum, they all provide great habitat. Sometimes they can be a nuisance, but seagrass blades can be a nuisance. I mean, when they wash up. So I think that that's an area that's just ripe for research, the habitat value of macroalgae. And part of it's a personality thing. The phycologists have not wanted to get into that as vigorously as the seagrass people. That's my take on that anyways. It's not official policy of the Department of Biological Sciences.
Do you know where the blue crab populations are located?
Well, I've only seen a few, but the Fish and Game folks have they've been coming up in their seines. I think in the Piscataqua mostly.
Are they correlated with the oyster reefs, or?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, there's so few of them. I don't think you have any distribution data really. But we actually found them about 12, 15 years ago in South Mill Pond. We found 2 of them, but they're pretty much here now, I guess.
Yeah, they have an established population.
Yeah. It's after 4 o'clock. Don't you people have to go home? All right.
Well, thank you, Ray.
Okay. Thank you.